Coming up in today's podcast.
But before I even moved 3 feet, a titter went right round the room. What on earth is Guy going to say now? Well, I began by reading the scripture. I think it's in Titus, where it says, "Elders among you should be grave, sober, not double-tongued." Well, the whole place just erupted. Mr. Morford, with a straight face, had been talking about laughter. Now Guy gets up, reads the scriptures, and everybody starts laughing. Now, I didn't do it to make them laugh. I did it to make a point that the ministry of JT Jr. was just so ridiculous that he was veering away from what the scriptures actually teach. That the elders among us should be sober and grave and not double-tongued. And most of them were double-tongued.
Welcome to the Get a Life podcast. Explore survivor stories. Uncover the hidden truths. Join our X-Cult conversations. You matter, and so does your story.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast. I am Cheryl. And today joining us is Richard Marsh, Andrea Becker, and our special guest today is Guy Wilson from the UK. We are all ex-members of the Exclusive Brethren, now known today as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. Today is actually a really special day as we have two guests on opposite ends of leaving the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. Andrea has just been out just over a year, whilst Guy has been out for 55 years. So I'm really excited to compare notes between the two dynasties that they both experienced. So welcome, everyone.
Hello, all.
Hello, Cheryl. Hello, Andrea. And hello, Richard.
It's very appropriate because the day we're recording this is the 5th of November. And as the English contingent will know, it's traditional to have a Guy on the 5th of November. In fact, if we're
I'll be running away from all the bonfires later.
Yeah, well, we won't be burning you today, Guy.
Okay.
We should have got Ron Fawkes on as well, and then we'd have had Guy Fawkes.
We should have had Ron Fawkes on as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Guy Wilson and Ron Fawkes would make a great combination.
The Canadians have no idea what we're talking about.
No. Okay.
No,
We could just have a spin-off podcast.
I'm going to be Googling later.
Yeah. Google Guy Fawkes. Let's see what you come up with.
Mm-hmm. And Fawkes is spelled Fawkes.
Exactly.
So today we are here to discuss Guy's story within the Exclusive Brethren. So I'm actually going to just hand the mic over to you, Guy. And if you just want to start off and let the viewers and listeners know which dynasty that you were a part of inside the Exclusive Brethren, and just give us a little bit of your experience inside there and how you finally got to get out of there.
Okay, I think I'll start with the 1950s. And I was about 15 when I came into fellowship in 1959, and I saw every brother in the meeting and had to explain why I wanted to remember the Lord in the breaking of bread. Today, I don't think anybody does that. Now, Gerald Cowell was the recognized leader after JT Sr. died in 1953, and he took meetings in 1959 in Central Hall, Westminster, and my father was there, and my father-in-law, who is Billy Peterson from New York, was also there with his wife, my mother-in-law, Alison, who is Canadian, and she's still around, aged 97. Gerald Cowell took meetings and was usurped basically by Mr. James Taylor Jr., known affectionately or otherwise as JT Jr., who insisted on separation from evil using the scripture in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19, "Come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing. I think I've got the quote about right. Mr. Cowell said, no, let's do not go out with haste. And he quoted a scripture from Isaiah somewhere. Well, within a few months, Gerald Cowell was withdrawn from by a man called David O'Prey, who was an Irishman living in Hornchurch, which is where my mother grew up. And my mother was just living down the road from Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Cowell and their son Brian. And Mr. and Mrs. Cowell were her surrogate parents, and she was very fond of them. And she went to Mr. Cowell's assembly meeting when he was withdrawn from, and came back home and said to my dad that she wanted to go out of fellowship with Mr. Cowell. Well, my dad persuaded her otherwise, and we stayed in the fellowship for another 9 years. And my mother was increasingly restless, and I have 2 brothers and a sister, and we became increasingly restless as well. And I remember saying to my mother on more than one occasion, when our friends were leaving in droves in 1960, 61, 62, and 1963, I said to my mother, all of our friends are either leaving or have left. Why can't we leave as well? Well, Dad thought the testimony of the brethren that we'd had 3 or 4 generations in was still the right one to be in. And so we stayed in there for another few years. And we objected to so many different things that were introduced by JT Jr. I can recall 40 things that we objected to. Things like babies breaking bread. That was around 1968. No pets ministry in 1960 or 61. The no eating with unbelievers. That was 1960. And there was a lovely couple with 2 children in our meeting, which was only a small meeting with 20 people. And Mr. Kennedy, Harold Kennedy, was a bank manager, and his mother and his auntie had been withdrawn from in Southend-on-Sea. And he went to see them, and he had a cup of tea with his mother, and he came back and told my dad that he'd had a cup of tea with his mother, and that he didn't think that having a cup of tea with somebody not in fellowship was wrong. And he was promptly withdrawn from, because nobody was supposed to have a cup of tea with his mother who was out of fellowship. So that was really the beginning of a very, very strict regime introduced by JT Jr. And it got worse and worse. Then
I just have a question for you there. You said about babies breaking bread. Did they allow babies to break bread by then, or they said they couldn't?
No, Jim Taylor in 1968 or thereabouts suggested that babies should eat, because that's what the scripture says, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. And he thought that babies should break bread. Well, we objected strongly to it, but the legal people in the meeting, who were followers of JT Jr., didn't agree with our objections, and so there were only 2 little babies in the meeting, and they were the legal family called the Deacons, and so they began to break bread, and it was just dreadful, and it didn't make any common sense to anybody. And that was
this was the
JT
beginning
Jr.
of giving babies alcohol at the supper meeting, right? The actual port with alcohol in it.
Well, do you know, my memory is pretty good, but I don't remember whether alcohol was given to the babies in 1968. I can't remember.
Okay. No, because it's a very big thing now, which I mean, I did, and I highly regret, is giving my 4 or 5 month old baby sips of alcohol port wine in the supper meeting. And if you don't do it, you're frowned down upon, and it must be alcohol port. So I'm just interested that whether it was something that was pushed from the very beginning, or.
No, I don't think it was. The alcohol regime, certainly in our little meeting of 20 people, had not taken effect. I never saw a bottle of whiskey even until 1970. Drinking wasn't very big, and we certainly didn't drink anything much at all. So, yeah.
Lucky you escaped that part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was coming on to 1964 when Walter Reeves, who was a major in the British Army during the war, he didn't join the non-combatant corps, which is known as the NCC, which most brothers did. He joined the Royal Engineers and went to Kowloon in Hong Kong and built bridges and this sort of thing. Well, by 1964, his eldest son, who was a very, very good friend of mine called Peter, was 12. And at the age of 12, you were expected to break bread or ask for fellowship. Well, Peter didn't want to ask for fellowship. And I remember going to a fellowship meeting and Peter was there. It was in a school, actually. We could still use school halls for fellowship meetings. And Peter said to me, I think this will be the last fellowship meeting we shall be attending, Guy, because I think we're going to be going out of fellowship pretty soon. And I said, oh dear, well, one of those things, Pete, I don't think it'll be long before I join you. So that was 1964. Then 1965 came along and W. Bruce Hales came to England. I think it was actually at the end of 64. And I met him. I never spoke to him, but I went to a fellowship meeting in London with him one evening. And he was quite a dynamic personality and brought a breath of fresh air to the meetings that we hadn't seen in rather stuffy old England. And in one meeting, he referred to Mr. George Markham, who was a very elderly gentleman. He was probably, don't laugh at this one, he's probably my age now, he was about 80. And in those days, I was only in my 20s, a man of 80 was an elderly gentleman. And he referred to George Markham as Sir George. And Mr. Markham just replied, please spare me that indignity, which was a classic comment from an English statesman, really. He was a wonderful man and a very good preacher. He wasn't taken up with all this nonsense. Anyway, Bruce Hales, a year later, was withdrawn from by Jim Taylor, and I think John Hales was withdrawn from at the same time because they'd been running what was known as the commercial system, bringing business into the assembly. And Jim Taylor thought this was wrong. Well, I think on that occasion, Jim Taylor was perfectly correct to do so. Then the next year or so, let me see, 1965, 66, yeah, I started working in London in 1964, and I was only 19 at the time, and I had about an 80-mile journey to London every day, so it's a 160-mile journey both ways, and I read the first 35 volumes of J.T. Junior. I read the entirety of Mr. Raven's Ministry, which I think is about 22 volumes. I read quite a bit of J.T. Senior's Ministry, all inside that year. By the time I was 20, I began to realize that there was something wrong. And I read a book, one of J.T. Junior's volumes, I can't think which one it was now, in which he said that he never knew anything about the commercial system. Well, I was in my bedroom and I shared a bedroom with my younger brother. And I said to my younger brother, Nicholas, who lived in Vancouver for several years from 1991 onwards, Nick, this is an absolute lie. Jim Taylor's lying. And I threw his ministry book across the room, and I have never picked up another green book since then. That was 1965 or 66. Now, I don't think I've read much ministry since that date, since I was about 20, when I began to have serious doubts about the whole exclusive brethren movement. I was embarrassed to even be known as an exclusive brother. I was working in the city in London. I worked for a small firm of accountants and began to qualify. My boss registered me with the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants as a student member, I wasn't supposed to be a student member because associations were totally wrong and banned by JT Junior. You couldn't be a solicitor, a barrister, an architect, a dentist, a doctor, an accountant, or a policeman, or a nurse. You couldn't be anything in those days. So I was enrolled with the association, and then I joined another association called the Royal Automobile Association. If your car breaks down, you can give the Royal Automobile Association a ring, and they'll come and mend your car or tow it away for you. So I was a member of 2 associations. Oh dear, this was serious stuff. But I never told anybody, I just kept it to myself. I never told anybody in my workplace that I was a member of the Exclusive Brethren. I always wore a very smart suit, a tie, and whatnot. And I dressed very nicely and had tailor-made suits. And it was a privilege to work in London, actually. So none of my colleagues ever knew. I never said a word about Christianity. I never said anything about Jesus Christ to anybody. I never used bad language. I'm sure my colleagues must have thought I was a little different, but we all got along famously. And my boss used to take me out on audits, and I'd go to meals with him. We'd go to a lovely pub on a cold February day, go to a pub in Hampshire or somewhere, and have a lovely hot meal in a pub. And they'd go back to do the audit of a company called F&G Mizzen, which were watercress growers. So my boss and I got on really well, and we kept in touch after I left his firm in 1970, by which time, of course, the Jim Taylor was at Aberdeen and going around the countryside, saying all sorts of stupid things. He was drunk most of the time. He'd been to Cleveland, Ohio, in the April, around Easter time, when my dear friend Alan Clarkson from Perth was there, and Jim Taylor ministered on having your hair hanging out and wearing headscarves. Alan Clarkson came from Cleveland to Edinburgh, to England, and then he and I met up, and we drove through the Lake District. We stayed in a couple of hotels in the Lake District, which we shouldn't have done. Hotels were banned. We shouldn't have eaten in restaurants, but we did. And then we
He's
drove
quite
to
a big
Edinburgh.
heavy now in the Brethren.
It's what?
He's quite up there now. He's a higher echelon member now.
Oh yeah, Alan. Yeah, and he lives in the
Yeah.
Netherlands now and drives a
Yeah.
Tesla motor car. I know, I've heard about it. Yeah. Anyway, we went to Edinburgh, and on the Saturday night, all the youngsters and Alan and I went to a hotel in the main street of Edinburgh for drinks, and there must have been, I think, 20 of us there. And there was a girl called Anne Veal. She came from the West Country. She was there as well. And David Saunderson was there. He was a good friend of mine. And Alan was telling us all about this hair down ministry and wearing headscarves. And in those days, there were 3 preachers selected on a Sunday. Well, we agreed that we wouldn't mention hair down or the latest nonsense. And sure enough, on the Sunday morning, Alan and I were both chosen to be preachers in Musselburgh. And there was a brother from Peterhead, I can't think of his name now. He was a Scotsman who was in favour of Jim Taylor. He preached first and said, "How wonderful all you sisters look with your hair down and your headscarves. Oh, how fantastic you look. Wonderful, you're complying with the ministry." Well, I got up next and stood up and said, "I want to read a scripture from the book of Micah. The best of us is as a briar, and the most upright worse than a thorn fence." And I said, "The brother in front of me has told you all how wonderful you are. I'm going to tell you what God thinks about you. The best of us is as a briar." Well, the silence in the room hung very heavy. The leading brothers on the front benches were opening their mouths wide. What's coming next? Well, for 20 minutes, I destroyed everything that the brother in front of me had preached. And then it was Alan Clarkson's turn. He got up to preach, and he just preached a regular gospel, didn't mention hair down, didn't mention the ministry, didn't mention Jim Taylor, and that was the end of the meeting. And afterwards, outside the meeting room, a brother just said to me, "Wow," he said, "you sure pulled the first preacher down a few pegs, didn't you?" Well, I might have done, but nobody challenged me. Nobody said a word against what I had said. And that was really quite staggering. And then it was only 3 months later, in July, that I was in Kingston, it's a suburb of London, really, and I was staying with a chap called Chris Fielder, who later moved to Scotland. He'd married Anna Cheeseman from Sheerness in Kent. And Chris and I had been great friends. We were very, very good friends. And that morning, we went to the morning meeting at 6 o'clock. And after the morning meeting, rumors started flying around about Jim Taylor being in bed with a young sister in Aberdeen. And I didn't know very much, but I knew just about that much. Anyway, I jumped on a train and went to Swanley in Kent, which is near Bromley. And David Saunderson and his sister Brenda met me at the station. Now, Brenda and David were both out of fellowship at the time. They'd been withdrawn from because they didn't agree with the Sabbath ministry, where their father and mother and them had a motor business, and they didn't want to close the business on a Saturday. So they were withdrawn from in March 1970. So they collected me from the station, and we drove to St. Margaret's Bay, which is near Dover, and we went to St. Margaret's Hotel, where we met their parents, who were also out of fellowship, and Mr. and Mrs. Leslie Pratt of Margate, which was in my meeting. They had been withdrawn from for not agreeing with Jim Taylor 3 months earlier. And we had the most amazing meal in this hotel. So 1, 2, 3, six brethren not in fellowship, and me still in fellowship. Oh, I don't know whether this would ever happen today or not, but it certainly happened in 1970. And I told them what little I knew about Aberdeen. And obviously their minds were absolutely gobsmacked to hear about Jim Taylor being in bed with Madeleine Kerr. Well, the next 2 or 3 days were dramatic. There was a very nice young lady that I was very friendly with. She was Hubert Kingston's daughter from Harrow. Her name was Moira. I heard that she only died about 4 years ago at the age of 70 with cancer. Anyway, I've still got Moira's letters. She was quite a character. And Moira and I met up 2 or 3 times over the next 2 or 3 days in London. And she'd been to stay with my parents and the rest of us only 2 or 3 weeks earlier. And we met just outside the jeweller's shop in Oxford Street. And she was looking at engagement rings in the window as I turned up to meet her and greet her. And I think she was planning on getting engaged or something. Anyway, we walked for probably a mile and a half all the way to Victoria Station on 2 or 3 nights. And the last night, which was the most dramatic of all, I was trying to persuade her to, forget about Jim Taylor and that I wasn't going to stay in the Exclusive Brethren. And I told her all that I knew about Aberdeen, and she was of the view that, she wanted me to stay in fellowship, and I was due to go to live in Harrow the following week because I'd taken up a new job in Hayes, Middlesex, near Heathrow Airport. Well, on the day of our actual split, she and I walked to Victoria Station. She came right on the platform, and as I hung my head out of the carriage door, she was in floods of tears, crying and pleading with me to stay in fellowship. And I said, Moira, I'm sorry, I simply can't. I'm not prepared to go along with Jim Taylor any longer. I've been opposed to him for several years, and this is the final straw, and I'm out. And that was the end. I've never actually seen or spoken to Moira since that day, and it's etched in my memory, and I've told the story many times about dear Moira. So it's quite sad.
Mhm.
Then 3 years later, what did I do? I married Jim Taylor's great niece, Margaret Peterson from New York, Billy Peterson's daughter. I had been to Canada and America in 1969. I don't know whether this is of any interest to you, but in July 1969, Estelle Taylor, Liz Taylor, that's Ben Taylor's daughter, Billy McCullough, the Whitfeld girls, Patsy and Edna, and one or two other sisters, and I went to the Mission Bell Motel. Oh dear, we were not supposed to go to the Mission Bell Motel, but we hired a bedroom for the day. And what do you think we did? We watched the moon landing. I think Mr. Armstrong landed on the moon, and all of us young brethren were sitting in the motel room watching the moon landing and chatting to each other. Absolutely amazing. And the things we got away with and did, we never told a soul what we were doing, and we got away with it.
And
So
principally, just to add for those who don't know, that Estelle Taylor was JT Jr.'s youngest daughter, is that right?
that's correct. She is the daughter of Renee Taylor, his second wife. So she's the stepsister of Consuela Hales, who married W. Bruce Hales. Yeah. Estelle was only about 19. She's about the same age as my wife and Liz. So she'd be now about 74. And yeah, oh, I didn't tell you this, that Moira Kingston, and my father found this out, Moira actually married Mrs. Madeline Kerr's son, Struan Kerr of Harrow.
Yes, I knew
forgot
that
to tell you that bit.
because her sister was in our interchange. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Now, I did have some notes here about the actual split in Canterbury, which was the meeting that we'd merged with, and I would like to just read some of the notes out. This is July the 27th, 1970. These are directly from my handwritten diary. My father prayed this evening, quote, "Oh, what would it be like if Jim Taylor were taken?" End of quote. We didn't know anything of last Saturday's performance. I prayed that no evil may be printed, such as vile language, etc. On the 28th, which was the Tuesday, there was a word by Leslie Morford on 1 Corinthians 1, verses 12 to 13, Theodore Deacon on 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 7 and 8, and David Worsley on Judges chapter 7, verses 3 to 4. David Worsley is the grandfather of Ryan Hetherington, who is also out now, and that wasn't in the diary. Chris Fielder told me at lunchtime on the Tuesday that Jim Taylor had been misbehaving with Mrs. Kerr of Harrow at Aberdeen. The report was flying around fast. David Saunderson, who was not in fellowship, had heard at 8:30 on that Tuesday morning. He told me later in the day. Stanley McCallum was withdrawn from in Detroit tonight by Jim Taylor while he was in an aeroplane. The following day, on the 29th, in Canterbury, there were words by, I put here, words by Ron Morrow, as Karen's father from Toronto, Jack Mooney, and a young fellow. And Stanley McCallum was reinstated tonight. Leslie Morford of Canterbury took the reading on Acts 28, verses 1 to 6, and we had a good bust up. He said, anyone who speaks against JT Jr., I am not prepared to walk with them. My friend Keith Groombridge, who was a farmer, aged about 23, asked, do we all agree that Mr. Taylor is the issue? It was pointed out to Keith that no man is ever the issue. After the meeting, I asked Mr. Morford and his wife Gwen why they did not contact Aberdeen for the facts. They had instead phoned Mr. C.C. Taylor Jr. of Cleveland, Ohio. The following night, which I think was the Wednesday, the meeting at Canterbury started at 7:30. The room was pretty full, probably 120 to 150 people there. And within 4 minutes, Mr. Morford had led a party out in support of a corrupt man who is free to go to bed with the wife of another man. Mr. Morford said, I'm not listening, as 38 adults and 11 children have gone. Now, David Robbins actually said that Jim Taylor had been found in bed with another man's wife, and that's what led to the Mr. Morford walking out shouting, I'm not listening. So the following day I wrote, we have lost the Margate meeting room, the Nottington meeting room, Deal and Canterbury. And then we had a meeting reading at Herne Bay, which Father, Mother and Nick attended. So we were all completely out of fellowship now, never been withdrawn from by anybody. So we never considered ourselves as being under assembly discipline. So here we are, 55 years later, still in that situation and happy to be free of it.
Wow.
Please ask me any questions you want to, and I'll do my best to answer them.
So everyone who was left in the meeting room who didn't get up and walk out were essentially withdrawn from.
Exactly. There were 38 people who left and 11 children, and there were about 110, 120 who stayed in, who didn't go out of fellowship, left the exclusive brethren. Yeah.
Okay, and this was in the locality of where?
Canterbury, in Kent.
Okay. That's crazy to imagine that.
Mm-hmm. So Aberdeen is like a massive topic with Bruce Hale still inside the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church today, as recently as the last couple of months. What would you say to those people in there? There's two questions I have. What would you say to those people in there that still believe this narrative that, number one, this never happened, or number two, he did it to try and see who his loyal followers are? And then my other part of the question is, what would you say to those people that do believe that this happened, that are still inside there and have the power to change and alter conversations?
Right. Well, Alan Clarkson is one who knows it happened. He and I corresponded for several months after Aberdeen. I've still got my letters to him and his letters back to me. He knew all about it.
And just so everybody knows that all the letters and everything that Guy is talking about in here, there's a folder below with all of the records of everything, including these letters he's discussing.
So what would I say about somebody like Alan Clarkson? I'll say this. I went to see him in Perth in 2004, which is 20 years ago. And my brother Kenneth came with me. We went to his office. He shook hands. He was very warm, very pleasant. And he said to us, basically, I stayed in because of my family.
Yeah.
He'd got his father, his mother, his sister, his business. He was in the firelighter business. And he stayed in there because of his family. And he, rather than sticking with his convictions, he wasn't married at the time, so he would have come out, and left his business and his family and been all alone.
So I assume that once this podcast is published, they'll have to have an assembly meeting in The Hague to clear Alan Clarkson's matters or otherwise withdraw from him, because he obviously wasn't really fully with Mr. Jim. Do you think that would be
Well, absolutely, Richard. He was traveling with me, staying in hotels, eating in restaurants, going to a hotel with young people, and having drinks with them on the Saturday night. No, he was an absolute rebel, just like the rest of us.
That's going to be a knockdown for him because The Hague used to be quite a chill meeting until he moved there. Now his word is law.
Yeah,
Really?
Yep.
He's a
I
big
think Bruce Hill said to the brethren in The Hague that they have to listen to him.
Well, I
But
know
as
more about.
somebody who left recently, it's very, very interesting because I had another leaver say to me that's been out a long time, say to me, well, Aberdeen isn't that interesting to the younger generation. And I said, yes, but it is, because so much of the system, I say our, but it's in the past now for all of us, is based off this pinnacle of Aberdeen and who believed it and who didn't. And there are people, I have heard this quote from somebody who is still in there, an older man, who says, I know Aberdeen happened and I know it's true, but I'm not leaving. And it's important for our generation to understand the truth. And like the podcast that explained it with Bradley McCallum was very interesting to me, because if they can lie about that, it makes you doubt everything. It would be so much easier for them to just have said, JT Jr. himself to say, I made a mistake. It was a shitty mistake. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. That's much more respectable than just lying and carrying on lying for this many years through so many leaders.
Well, if I may so say, there's a letter from Madeleine Kerr when she was in court in Amsterdam or The Hague or somewhere, where she admits to being in bed with Mr. Taylor.
Here is the letter you'll see on the screen from Madeleine Kerr, her testimony. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to read out something that is particularly very clear in here. I can only declare that nothing improper has happened. It is only that I lay totally undressed under a sheet. Taylor wore his pajamas. I also found it strange indeed, but I did it because he asked. At that moment, I did not fully understand what his intentions were. It kind of hits the gut reading that. It's heart-wrenching to hear her say that she didn't know what his intentions are. And so I just leave that with you guys. Those people, especially those people who read this testimony and blindly look past at what all the clues are inside all of these letters. In my opinion, this is the start of when females were so taken advantage of. And in this case, I mean, he's saying that he was using her to draw out his opposers. So in either way, whether that was it or whether he was having this affair with her, it doesn't matter. He still was using her either way. And that I don't agree with.
And also, and this might be of great interest, 3 weeks after the Aberdeen episode, Madeleine Kerr and her husband, Mr. Kerr, were staying with JT Jr. in New York, and Mr. Taylor was spending several hours in the bedroom with Madeleine, and Mrs. Taylor, Renee, was so concerned about it that she phoned my mother-in-law, Mrs. Peterson, and told her what was happening. Well, this was in the days before mobile phones or cell phones, and my mother-in-law waited until Billy Peterson had come home from work and told him what Renee Taylor had said to her on the phone. And he said, right, don't answer the phones, don't do anything. I'll take this up this evening in the meeting. Well, he got to the meeting, and there's a Wednesday night meeting on Nostrand Avenue or something like that. And before he could say anything at all, Jim Taylor said to Bill Peterson, he said, I need a doctor, but he needs a doctor. I withdraw from you, Bill. Now, pandemonium reigned, and I can't remember exactly what Bill said at the time, but he must have said something about Jim and Aberdeen and Madeline Kerr, and a lot of the brethren split, and some Mr. Taylor walked out, and JT number 3 walked out, and several other brethren walked out of the room. Mrs. James Taylor 3, I think her name is Ilsa, remained in the room with Billy Peterson, Alison and the family, and Sarah and half the other brethren. So New York was split right down the middle of Aberdeen, and this was how America, or New York in particular, split 3 weeks after Aberdeen through a similar episode with Mrs. Kerr being in bed with Jim Taylor in New York as well as Aberdeen.
And wasn't that when that second newspaper article was published and there was a photograph of him with his arm around Madeline Kerr?
Well, I've got several newspaper cuttings from that period, also 1964, where the Daily Mail published several articles. And, I'm happy to share them with you if you'd like to see them. And yes, there was lots of newspaper articles about Jim Taylor and Aberdeen.
I've included here quite a few newspaper clippings that you've seen previously on the screen and on the screen right now. And I'll have these attached in a link below for you to peruse through. And many of these we've gone through in some of our other Aberdeen podcasts, but I figured we'd put them back in here again. But there's a couple slides here that I really want to go through and read. And these are excerpts from BDH talking about JT Jr. and Aberdeen. And for those of us that are on the outside and can see through this whole fiasco of Aberdeen, it is shocking what I'm going to read to you. So this is in Sydney, August 22nd of 2010. This is BDH. I was thinking coming down here of our beloved's surface here in 1970, when he was last here, January 1970. Do you remember it, Alf? You would have been here. You remember that? And Alf says yes. BDH. Young people here wouldn't remember our beloved. We were standing up the back and we clapped him as he walked in. And he walked down that wall there and he was acting as though he was intoxicated. He was staggering along. He was actually very weak, but he was putting it on, you see. And we've had many, many accounts of people on here saying that his alcoholism was quite progressed. So, this is BDH still trying to cover up for him. The next one is someone making a comment. I was thinking too of a test like Aberdeen, which many of us wouldn't have had to face, and we may be here, but just fear for myself that there may be another influence that would take me a wrong way. And BDH says, yes, well, see, that's a good question that you raise. See, anybody that really had any love for our beloved couldn't have possibly believed genuinely that he was a corrupt man. His influence, his generosity of spirit, his spirit of fatherhood, the drawing power of his ministry. We knew it as younger persons that you were drawn. You were drawn away from the world. You were drawn away from sin in the flesh. That's the influence of Christ, of course. The test at Aberdeen was to even consider that our beloved could have failed. Wasn't a question of the facts or the details or circumstances. The trap was to believe or entertain the idea that these men could fail morally. I'm not even going to go and comment on this. It's absolutely too absurd to even comment. It would throw me into a Cheryl rant for another hour, and we don't have time for that. So I'm going to let you guys sit and try and digest this and comment below what you think of this.
I want to go back to when you were talking about W.B. Hales being shut up over commerce in the assembly. And with what you know what's going on today, like what are your thoughts? What happened in the system days back then and to what you hear is going on now? What are your thoughts on those very two similarities on how they've been able to take the system days and plant them into what we have today?
Well, I think it was very primitive in 1964 or thereabouts, where Bruce Hales was trying to get brethren businesses to run more profitably. And he was introducing time and motion studies. And he went to Manchester and looked at David Clapham's business and Angus Clapham. And Peter Wilkinson was there as well in part of the landscaping business. And so the Clapham family and Peter Wilkinson became very involved with Bruce Hales. And then, of course, David Clapham was found in a strip club in London, and he was withdrawn from by Jim Taylor because he denied being in the strip club, and Jim Taylor withdrew from him for lying. Well, he just went on his own sweet way, came out with his wife and family, and left the Exclusive Brethren completely, and was never heard of since. So that was around 1965 or 66. In terms of the commercial system, it was very minor, very, very minor compared with what it is today, from what I hear, where we're looking at millions upon millions of money and billions in brethren coffers today, and in trust funds owned by Bruce Hales, with the UBT being owned by a discretionary trust that's owned by the Hales family, no doubt. And it's just, well, I describe it as a money factory now. It's not a Christian religion. And interestingly, the Honourable Mr. Justice Cotter, in his judgment in the Lance Christie case issued in September, referred to the PBCC. Is it PBCC?
Yeah.
He referred to it as the Plymouth Brethren Church, and he omitted the word or the letter C for Christian. And I wrote to him, and I've sent you a copy of my letter earlier, about half an hour or an hour ago, in which I noted that he called it the PBC instead of the PBCC, and taken out the word Christian, which was absolutely right, because it is no longer a Christian organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you didn't get a reply, I expect.
No, Richard, of course not. But I didn't expect a reply, but he obviously got it. And when I was up in the Leeds Crown Court last week, and he obviously had read what I said, and he actually said in court that the elders or the brethren had directed Jed Christie and Stefan and Deb in this case, in the case against Lance. And of course, the KC, Mr. Jeremy Reed, said, "I don't accept that, my lord." He didn't say, "It's not true, my lord," because if he said it's not true, he'd be calling the judge a liar. He just said, "I don't accept it." But the judge ignored that completely. And the judge's remarks remain that Jed and whatnot were egged on and backed up by the Plymouth Brethren Church.
Mm-hmm. Another question I had, I want to go back to when you started realizing everything was wrong in there. What are some basic foundational issues that came up in JT Jr.'s dynasty when he reigned that you think really turned this church into a cult that it is today?
Well, the beginning of the end really was the introduction of a meeting every night, and about 7 or 8 meetings on a Sunday. Back in the 1950s until the early 1960s, the breaking of bread took place at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and we had a reading at 3:30 and a gospel preaching at 6:30. And there was on Monday there was a prayer meeting, and on Tuesday once a month there was a ministry meeting, and on Wednesday there was a reading, and that was it for the week, except for fellowship meetings now and again on weekends, but not every weekend, and a care meeting once a month. Then the introduction of meetings every night meant that Jim Taylor was trying to control everybody. But he didn't control me, because I never did attend a meeting every night, ever, except when I went to California in 1969, and Billy McCullough took me to a meeting every night because I was his guest, and he went to a meeting every night, so I went too. But that's the only time I've ever been to a meeting every night.
It's so true, that saying that some people just cannot be brainwashed, and you are one of them. It was like any control came and you're like, no, fight against it, not me.
Well, I wrote to Andrew Robertson, and I was in in touch with him. He was withdrawn from by Jim Taylor on the 22nd of March 1970, and he and I were corresponding, and he had raised about 40 different points against JT Jr. And funnily enough, I had raised most of the 40 points that he had also raised. And I've probably still got these 40 points
I was
somewhere
going
or
to
other.
ask you if you remember any of them, because it would be really interesting to compare these 40 points with Bruce Hales that's in power today.
Yeah, because I wonder if
Uh,
a lot of those things that were banned back then or declared not allowed are things that a lot of the brethren nowadays would just do anyway. They sometimes, would do it with other brethren knowing, or they do it behind the scenes. Like, for example, the rule about no pets. And I was just talking to another leaver about this recently. Pets, were taken away from people, and they were put down and given to shelters. And nowadays a lot of brethren have pets, and they might have it on the down low, oh, we have a farm cat outside or a guinea pig, but nonetheless a lot of them have pets now, and it was an issue of the truth back in the day.
really? Okay.
I think it's super important that we read these points out. You've got them laid out very well here, Guy. So the first point is babies breaking bread. Wrong. Meeting every night. Unnecessary. Association ministry. Highly questionable. Not being permitted to enter professions was stupidity. Not being able to wear a watch or have a clock on the meeting room wall was ridiculous. Sisters wearing headscarves. Simply awful. Sisters wearing their hair down. Dreadful for older women. My mother resented this. And we actually have a picture here of smashing outfits from back then before the scarves came on and the hair went down. No college university degrees. I wonder why. No holidays and having to request permission to go anywhere except the bathroom. 6 o'clock morning meeting, 1968. What was wrong with 11 a.m.? Confessions in public, 1965 and 1967. Levites but no missionaries. Whiskey drinking promulgated. JT Jr.'s alcoholism and being dried out in 1965, largely covered up by James III. The Aberdeen affair, which shocked the world at large with extensive newspaper coverage. The one-man ministry aspect of JT Jr. Popery. Being 100% behind JT Jr. Totally bonkers. Hitler left a trail of destruction all over Europe, but JT Jr. left a trail of destruction all over the world. Divided households. Sabbath ministry, 1967, defied scripture. 6 days shalt thou labor. Why did the defect ministry not apply to JT Jr.? Merging smaller meetings to gain more central control. Withdrawing from anyone who challenged JT Jr. The forcing of youngsters into marriage at a very early age. The whole concept of separation was taken to extremes. Where was the gospel outreach? When was the great command of Matthew 28 verse 19 superseded by JT Jr.'s 2 Timothy 2 charter? Jim Taylor's ruthless handling of Gerald Cowell in 1959. Eating ministry. Hundreds of brethren left over this nonsense. Jim Taylor withdrawing from Stanley McKellum, traveling in an aircraft back from Aberdeen. The eradication of a witness to being in bed with Mrs. Kerr. The 3 great ministries were hailed as divinely inspired and put on a par with the scriptures. How wrong can they get? Brothers kissing each other. What's the matter with a firm handshake, please? The inability of youngsters to enter into a proper courtship was wrong. JT Jr. suggested that swearing was perfectly in order. Most drunkards swear. JT Jr. suggested that the scriptures were no longer needed. These were not the words of a believer. And then it goes on to say, I gave Philip Woodcock and Timothy Sharp this list of items and a few more besides, and they still wanted me back. I love them all dearly, but not that much. Guy Wilson, December 2002, posted on the Dick Wyman's website.
Well, the Dick Wyman website, I had quite a lot to say, and when I went to see, I wanted to see a friend of mine, Geoffrey Groombridge, in Nonnington. He's another farmer from the Canterbury meeting, and I eventually went to see him 10 years ago this month. and we had a really nice couple of hours together, chatting away about old times and so on, and very pleasant. And he came out at Aberdeen, but went back in 3 weeks later with his brother Alan. Alan only had one leg. He'd had an accident. He had gangrene in his leg after a cricket ball hit his leg, I think. Geoffrey didn't want to meet up with me to start with, and he said, "Well, you've been saying some things about Mr. Taylor on the Dick Wyman website," and I just said to him, "Well, Geoffrey, we all grow up, and we all mature, and trust me, I'm really the same old guy that you used to know." And he agreed to see me, so we had spent a couple of hours together. And I really loved seeing him. I did meet Alan, his brother, and had a chat with him in 2002 when Bruce Hales first came on the scene. Alan was all gung-ho about Bruce Hales. "Oh, Mr. Bruce, Mr. Bruce this and Mr. Bruce that. And he's relaxing things and making life easier and so on." And I thought, "Oh, all right, fine." But nobody has ever tried to persuade me to come back into fellowship, which is interesting. And then I did attend a meeting. It was a ministry meeting 10 years ago in Canterbury. And it was very carefully orchestrated, with Geoffrey Groombridge's son, Clive Groombridge, meeting me at the gate, walking me to a designated seat on the back row with him sitting next to me, away from most of them, but there was a very good-looking young married sister with a baby about 4 seats along with me. She was so well dressed and scrubbed up, I couldn't believe it. What, brethren look like this these days? Because I don't normally see them. Anyway, the ministry meeting was quite fun. There was a hymn and a prayer, and then a second cousin once removed of mine, it was Stuart Clark from Canterbury. He was the grandson of one of the Woodcocks, Paul Woodcock. Anyway, Stuart Clark gave a word and said, among other things, "Are you right with God?" And I thought to myself, "Oh, Stuart's pointing at me." So anyway, then Theodore Deacon's son, I'd never met him before. He'd been born after the split. And he gave a word on something or other, and I was very mildly targeted. They all knew I was going to be there, and Bruce Hales had to give permission for me to be there, I think. So they all behaved themselves. No mention was made of Mr. Taylor, Mr. Symington, John Hales, Bruce Hales, J.N. Darby, Mr. Raven, Mr. Coates, or any of them. Absolutely nothing was said. It was all very orchestrated, very nicely done.
How did they know how to take a meeting without mentioning the great men? That's all they talk about now.
I don't know, my
They
darling.
don't talk about the Bible.
I don't know. This was a traditional ministry meeting that I had known from 50 years earlier. Anyway, I looked at my watch and the time was 7:36. The meeting started at 7:15 and the meeting finished. And I said to Clive, "What's this? It's 21 minutes and the meeting's over." And he said to me, "Oh yeah, we don't hang around." Well, the meetings in my day were taking about an hour, and a word was 20 minutes long, or thereabouts. Anyway, afterwards, I mingled with the dear brethren, and we chatted and we shook hands. There were 3 people who didn't shake my hand. One was Theodore Deacon, the other one was Stuart Clark, and there was one other. But all the rest of them did, and they were very nice to me. Nobody asked me to rejoin. Oh, except one. Peter Bedford said, "You know where you belong."
The famous words.
That must have been surreal, like stepping back into time. My gosh.
The context of all that is that they just had their terrible charity commission crisis, and they were desperate to prove that former members and members of the public could attend their meeting halls. They were public places of worship. Otherwise, you'd never have got in there. I mean, I saw the whole process from the other side because I was in the Brethren at that time, and they were trying to get non-brethren to attend meetings. And as you say, it was all orchestrated. If there was someone coming to the meeting, non-brethren coming, everyone was phoned round ahead of time and warned. And you were told, there's no reference to Bruce Hales, no praying for Mr. Hales, none of that. And keep it to the simple gospel. And at some point, they introduced having, I think, 4 hymns at the beginning and 4 hymns at the end to kind of fill out the time with a lot of singing, which of course they never did for ordinary meetings. And of course, the people who, normally on a Tuesday night, it was a free-for-all, you would wait until someone was moved to give a word. But of course, if it was and equally for readings, they would ask round. But if there was an outside visitor, it was all pre-programmed. The whole thing was a deception and a smoke and mirrors to make so that when the visitors came in, they saw one version of what the brethren were, and then if there weren't visitors there, it went back to all the usual old bullshit.
Okay.
Yeah, I can confirm that as well. And we were told how to behave a little bit, behave extra well and be friendly to the person coming and whatnot. Whereas normally on the street, if that person was walking down the street, you wouldn't even greet them and say hi, or hello.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think this is very pertinent because from what I understand, about 30% of the brethren left in the years from, well, the late 50s through to 70. And I can see the same thing happening again because at some point this whole ATO thing is going to hit the fan and there's going to be arrests, and the brethren are generally going to realize that the whole top tier of the brethren system is utterly corrupt. And we know from our own contacts that there's a lot of brethren in there just waiting for that excuse to walk out with some dignity. And so we're going to see history repeating itself. And they're going to be the fights over the ownership of the meeting room, whether the trustees are in or out. So I think it's really timely for you to, give everyone a heads up as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, and it really is still relevant what happened back then to today because it's just a repeating of history, like you say, Richard.
Yeah.
It's all coming unraveled. And, I think Bruce Hales is absolutely terrified because there's so many people leaving now, and hearing from people inside, there's a lot of damage control being done in the meeting. A lot of you wouldn't dare doubt the truth and you wouldn't even think about leaving and all this stuff.
Scare tactics and
yeah, exactly. And people are waiting for another Aberdeen. They call it like another Aberdeen,
they call
don't
it
they,
the
Cheryl?
Aberdeen door. They're waiting for another Aberdeen moment. Yeah.
It's rather interesting that there are something like 55,000 PVC members, and if they were to sit in the Wembley Stadium, which is a football stadium in England, there would be 35,000 seats left empty. The stadium has 90,000 people for a football match. 55,000 seats filled, 35,000 empty. I mean, it's amazing to even have the slightest thought that the PVC is God's chosen people, like the children of Israel, is so ridiculous as to be completely absurd.
No,
to think that Wembley, I think was Wembley full with 90,000 people to see a Taylor Swift concert. That really made me laugh. I was like, more people like Taylor Swift than they do Bruce Hales.
Oh,
yeah, exactly.
I'll happily follow that cult.
When that all went down and you finally were able to leave, Guy, like what? I mean, yes, it was how many decades ago, but what advice would you give to those people that are in that moment that you were in, because you were in that same moment, right? You were wanting to leave, and then a door finally opened and that was your final straw. What would you say to those people that are in there with 1 foot in, 1 foot out in the exact same position you were all those years ago?
Well, Cheryl, I think it's very different for them than it was for me, in that I had an independent job working in London. I was not working for a brethren company, whereas I think today there's so much interaction with brethren working for brethren that wasn't the case 55 years ago. and I don't know what advice I would give them today, except to say, if you're running a business and you've signed an agreement in 2012 or 2015 that if you leave the brethren, you'll lose all your business and you'll lose your wife and you'll lose your children and your grandchildren, get those agreements ripped up and annulled, because Lance Christie signed those agreements. And I said to him, why didn't you take legal advice? He said, oh, because I trusted them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the people who are in there today obviously trust each other, but the trust is misplaced because the people in power have so much power that they can persuade these people to sign anything, and they will.
They won't even read it. They'll sign it without even reading it.
Really?
And they'll do it out of fear.
Yeah.
They do it out of fear? That's unbelievable.
I'm sure they would, because if you don't do as you're told, you lose everything.
Yeah.
And I do think people are standing more up to the whole UBT fear tactic. I mean, I've talking to quite a few insiders in there that refuse to have their businesses tied up with UBT and all of that, those bells and whistles. And they're hounded all the time over it. But I do think that there is a certain element of taking back your power that you need to do right now. All those insiders that have that 1 foot in and 1 foot out is you've got to learn that the power lies with you, not with Bruce, not with any UBT representative. You can say no. And I think that's really one of the biggest missing keys right now, over top of this fear mongering that they're placed in, right? Is that if you believe in yourself enough to say no and trust us to say that there's hundreds, if one person stands up and says no, there'll be tons that follow. I firmly, firmly, firmly still stand by that if just one person can start standing up in a locality, you'll have multiple people doing it behind you.
It might take time, especially with the peer pressure that's in there now, but it will be noticed eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we were in fellowship all those years ago, there were a few of us who were, shall we say, a little bit surreptitious in that we would ask very awkward questions and we wouldn't make statements. If you make a statement, they can say, you said such and such. No, I didn't make statements, just ask questions. Now, there was one famous occasion when I was fast asleep at a 9 o'clock meeting in Canterbury. I was exhausted every weekend. And my nickname was F.E. Raven, Mr. F.E.R. And Mr. Morford, the leading brother, saw me fast asleep by the back door somewhere, and he said, I wonder what Mr. Raven is thinking today. And I had read, this must have been, I don't know, I remembered something that J.T. Jr. had said. And instead of quoting Mr. Raven, I quoted J.T. Jr. And I said, well, Mr. Morford, I've just been pondering what J.T. Jr. has recently said, that most of us are off the track most of the time. A sentiment with which I fully concur. Well, the whole place just erupted with laughter. Guy quoting J.T. Jr. against the leading brother. It was hilarious. Oh, there was another famous occasion when Mr. Morford had been at meetings with Mr. Taylor, when the meetings were all about Isaac. Now, the name Isaac means laughter. Mr. Morford comes back to Canterbury. This was probably 1969 or 1970, and gives a word on Isaac in Genesis, how Isaac means laughter. He said, we must all laugh. But he said it with such a straight face, very sober. We must all laugh and be happy and joke and so on. Well, I clambered over Geoffrey Groombridge's leg and Alan Groombridge's leg and eventually got to the microphone to give the second word. But before I even moved 3 feet, a titter went right round the room. What on earth is Guy going to say now? Well, I began by reading the scripture. I think it's in Titus, where it says, elders among you should be grave, sober, not double-tongued. Well, the whole place just erupted. Mr. Morford, with a straight face, had been talking about laughter. Now Guy gets up, reads the scriptures, and everybody starts laughing. Now, I didn't do it to make them laugh. I did it to make a point that the ministry of JT Jr. was just so ridiculous that he was veering away from what the scriptures actually teach. That the elders among us should be sober and grave and not double-tongued. And most of them were double-tongued.
So one of the biggest things that they use inside the PPCC still to this day is that JT Jr. wasn't drunk. I still have, of the younger generation, still comes forward and says that's not true. That's just how he talked. So coming from your experiences with listening to JT Jr.'s meetings, have you ever heard him drunk?
No, I've attended 4 meetings, one in Nostrand Avenue, one in Alexandra Palace, one in Dorking, and the other one in Park Street when I was, in my 20s. Drink was not such a big issue in those days, and I did not actually see him drunk. I didn't see him with a bottle of whiskey under his chair or a glass of whiskey under his chair, but I am only one person and I didn't really know him. But if you ask my wife, who lived in New York until she was 20, she saw him drunk on many occasions, with his speech seriously slurred. And I think at Aberdeen, he must have been very, very drunk. Although I've never listened to the tapes, I've heard other people say that the tapes clearly show that he was under the influence of alcohol.
David, where have you been? Thank God for you. Thank God for you every time. And you've been stinking somewhere. Where you been doing that? In hell. You haven't had any privilege to do that. You feeling better? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. Are you feeling better, David? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. The whole thing. Where were the intestines? Were that trouble? The hell with them. Hell with them. Hell with them. You hear that, George? George! George! Did you hear? Yes. Hell with the other one. Hell with the other one. David's all right. And we're going to keep him all right through these evenings. Stay away, good dude. What do you think we're going to get on with all these songs from Detroit? To hell with them. Hell with them, I said. Hell with them. You big bum, you. You never had it so good. And don't you think you're going to go away with this stuff. You here. What's your name? Son of a bitch. John Deacon. Get up. You look like nothing. Sit down. You never had it like this before. Eric, wait. You wait, Eric. Well, get up and perform. Eric, get up. Get up, Eric. Get up. Eric, get up. Get up. never had it like this before. Hey, you stupid people here, what do you think I am? I'm a professor. Yeah, you. I'm not finished with you yet. You not get up. I'm not finished with you yet. Well, I'll tell you this. You don't mention the cars anymore, numbers or what the hell I am. You never had it like this before. No? That son of a bitch. I be careful using the word son of a bitch because I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. You have to be careful about it. Is everything all right with your bowels? You never had it so good. Oh, no, sit down. I would like you to introduce you to Nicodemus. And will you answer the question that I will ask you, Nicodemus? You couldn't. Who are you? Who are you? Get the hell out of here. Hell, I said. Hell out of here. You big bum there, you Bennett. What are you doing there? You never had it like this before. Now, we have some other things before us, you know. What I want to be being before you. What I want to be. There are things that I would like to bring before you.
Yeah. And an interesting quote that we there was a video program sent out to all the brethren worldwide probably 2-3 years ago, and it was called The Journeys of These Great Men, and they went over each great man's life with people telling stories about each great man. I think you know what I'm talking about here, Cheryl. And they have JT Jr.'s son, JT the Third, talking about meeting up with his father right after Aberdeen in an airport. He wanted to go out and get his JT Jr. wanted to get a drink at a bar, and he said, you know, I haven't drunk all weekend. And for some reason, this is a very important story for JT the Third to tell on this tape so that it goes all around the world and he can tell this important story. I mean, who's lying here? Someone's lying here, you know? And they make such an emphasis to cover up what actually happened. It's actually just a joke.
Yeah. And I think that's what I was trying to do is it's just all the questions that come up at me of when these insiders who have one foot in, one foot out start having conversations about Aberdeen. These are some of the things that are get thrown back into their face is that no, he wasn't drunk. He doesn't drink. He never fondled women the way that the stories say that he fondled women. You know, Aberdeen never happened. And, you know, if it did, it was a test of loyalty is what he was trying to do is figure out who was with him, who wasn't.
And yet there's firsthand accounts, which is what the younger generation in there don't know about until they start watching the Get a Life podcast and reading accounts of older ex-brethren who have the true story. Like Dennis Ragg's wife, who, thought that it was going to happen to her to be fondled by JT Jr. And she was preparing herself on what to do because she was terrified. This is true stuff. You just need to get it from the actual people who were there, like you, Mr. Guy.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Yeah, I think it's very true. I wasn't at Aberdeen itself, obviously, but believe me, the reports that I heard, I knew Dr. Thompson, who was there. He was doctor to JT Jr. when he needed him. The Gaysford twins, they were nursing him in 1964 when he was in hospital in New York being dried out for alcohol poisoning. So it's all pretty well documented. I knew Ben Taylor, Uncle Ben, Jim Taylor's elder son, JT3's brother, and he was totally clear that his father was dried out in 1964 when the Hale system was in full swing.
Yeah.
And so what has your life been like since you've got out of the Brethren?
Well, I qualified as a certified accountant, and in 1976 I got married in 73 to Margaret. So we've been married 51 years. We've got 2 children, 3 grandchildren, and when after I'd qualified, about a year later, we went off to live in Bermuda. And we'd been there for our first wedding anniversary in 1974. And I so loved it over there. I said, I'm going to come back here to live. Well, she found me a job working for the government of Bermuda. So I went there for 3 years for a 3-year contract. And then after the 3 years, I got another job with Chevron Oil Company as their assistant treasurer. I stayed there for another 10 years, almost 10 years. So I was there 12 and a half years altogether, and had a great job, great life. The children were brought up there and loved it. And they've often thanked me very much for bringing me up in such a lovely environment and nothing to do with the Brethren. I've survived quite well, done okay, just about by the skin of my teeth, made a few mistakes, but as long as your mistakes are fewer than your successes, you're okay.
I like to ask all of the guests we have on here is like, what advice would you give to those insiders that are listening right now and getting ready to leave or having thoughts about leaving?
Okay, get your ducks lined up in a row. I think that's the key thing to do. Talk to people who are out while you're still in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I was doing. I was talking to people who'd been withdrawn from, I was going to stay with them, I was eating with them, and they were a great help to me. One of them was Mr. Pratt, who was he was 45 years older than I was. And he was instrumental in steering me against remaining in the Brethren for the previous 5 years, from 1965 onwards, really. And he had a very clear opinion or judgment of Jim Taylor, who was actually his best man. He married Peggy McLean from Long Island, and there was a sister called Miss Johnson who was in New York, and she was a bit of a mole, and she used to write to Mrs. Pratt and tell her what was going on in New York. So Mr. and Mrs. Pratt had first-hand knowledge. Now, we never knew about the existence of Miss Johnson until after the split, when Mr. and Mrs. Pratt told me that their source of information was Miss Johnson over the previous few years. And it is amazing. Mr. and Mrs. Pratt were just so against Jim Taylor that they never attended a 6 o'clock morning meeting. They just refused to go. And they were not withdrawn from for that. And that, I think it was just a small meeting, and we were quite a happy-go-lucky meeting, really, in many ways. And unlike places like Harrow, where Moira Kingston was, or Perth, where Alan Clarkson was, these places were dominated by people who were trying to climb the Levitical ladder, if I may call it that.
Mhm.
But there was nobody in our meeting who was trying to be a Levite.
And another question I have to you. We know that a lot of the higher ups watch our podcast, including Bruce himself. What would you, if he's listening to this right now, what advice would you have to say to him?
Bruce, just come clean with the brethren. Tell them that you're a fraud, that you're not really the man of God. You're an ordinary person. You're a sinner just like the rest of us. All men have sinned and come short of the glory of God. You are no exception. You are probably worse than the rest. Just as Micah said, the best of us is as a briar, and the most upright worse than a thorn fence. That is you, Brucey boy.
Amen.
Amen to that. Yeah. But may the Lord bless the word.
Amen.
Oh,
Wow.
man.
That was very, very well said. Wow. I felt that to the core of me. I think we'll end the podcast there. I think, yeah, that was very well said, Guy.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on and giving us a brief look into your life before leaving and after leaving, and yeah, all of your insights from your other podcast with Lance Christie, and we're very appreciative of your time that you've given us.
Oh, it's been a bit of fun, really. Catch me while you can, while I'm still alive.
It's important. It's very, very, very important for your generation to have your stories told in some way, shape, or form. So yeah.
I'll do another one sometime if ever you want me to.
Absolutely. Oh yes, we'll always bring, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Richard did ask me several months ago, didn't you, Richard?
Yeah, I think I did. We've had quite a bit of correspondence about various things.
What was that story that you were starting to tell before we started recording the podcast? It was about some letter that you'd written. Do you remember, Richard?
I've written. Oh, yes, I have. I've just written a letter to Garth Christie. I don't know whether any of you know him, do you?
Yeah.
You know him? Okay. Dear Garth, here is my letter to the Honourable Mr. Justice Cotter. So I start off like that, and I just copied and pasted the letter to Mr. Justice Cotter, and then I've sent it to you anyway, to Cheryl and Richard. Then I go on to say, over the past few years, I've heard quite a lot about you from your brother Lance. Nothing derogatory, of course. He has great affection for you. I think I must have said that rather tongue-in-cheek. One thing he has not confirmed is whether or not you have ever actually turned to Christ in recognition of your sinful state and repented of your sin and become a follower of Christ. I have met some insiders, brackets, yes, they do speak to me, close brackets, who have never had a conversion experience. Did you? Could you possibly help me with the reason why most of you folks in the PBC, no, I'm not calling it the PBCC, it's the PBC, okay? And I mentioned this in my letter to Mr. Justice Cotter. Most of you folks in the PBC do not comply with the provisions of the charity commissioners that gave you charitable status, namely that you treat us ex-PBs with compassion and courtesy. I understand that your charities claim over £40 million per annum from the taxpayer. 7 years after you were born, when I was 18, the attached article was published in the Daily Mail. It's all about Jim Taylor. Have a little read through and let me know what you think of Mr. Jim Taylor, who was my wife's great uncle. I've been out for nearly 55 years, but have never been withdrawn from. I have never had a visit from a priest either. I understand that your father had 27 separate visits from 3 priests in inverted commas, and at the end they arbitrarily excommunicated him. I remember your father taking fellowship meetings in Maidstone on the topic of, don't laugh at this one, on on the topic of masturbation, and understand that he was visited by Oliver Smalden and David Marrison and told that they could not come into his house because it was leprous and that he was going to spend eternity in the lake of fire. Lance claims to have dragged Oliver Smalden and you to your mother's deathbed to give you an opportunity to put this right. Mr. Smalden died without putting it right, but you still have the opportunity to do so publicly for what it is worth. You might like to pass this to Mr. Bruce D. Hales, who was a schoolboy in 1964. This is when the article was published in the Daily Mail. Little did he realize that he was destined to become so great, like a big fish in a tiny pond. Did you know that if 55,000 PBC members were to sit in the Wembley Stadium, there would be 35,000 seats left empty? To have even the slightest thought that the PBC is God's chosen people, like the children of Israel, is so ridiculous as to be completely absurd. You should leave the position, in quotes, or the testimony, in quotes, both titles being erroneous, while you can. But make sure that you take with you your wife and family, otherwise you will be classified as a leper, unclean, wicked, a sinner, an opposer, and lots of other horrible names. You will be treated in the same manner that you have treated Lance and your other family members who left. Of course, you would need to revoke any ridiculous agreements like those that Lance signed in 2012 and again in 2015. Yes, I have seen them. I am a member of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants and joined in 1967 while I was still, quote, in fellowship with Mr. Jim Taylor, but did not agree with him. I met him 4 times, in Park Street, Alexandra Palace, Dorking, and Nostrand Avenue. He could be very charming, but also ruthless, as shown by his treatment of W.B. Hales and John S. Hales in 1965. My final comment is this. Hitler left a trail of destruction all over Europe. Mr. Taylor left a trail of destruction all over the world. Kind regards. And then I give him my extracts from my diary of July 1970, Aberdeen.
Wow. That's incredible.
That's intense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Good for you.
Yeah.
I like
Well,
how you're demoting them with their title, PBC.
Yeah, exactly. I think you should use it, the PVC, rather
I
than
totally,
PVCC.
yeah, I think it's exactly what we should use now is PBC. Yeah.
Well, you could put it out that Mr. Justice Cotter calls it the PVC without being Christian.
And we could just say it's the Plymouth Brethren cult.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, perfect.
Not
Yeah.
even a church.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, it's so infinitesimally small, 55,000 people. It's just so stupid.
mhm, yeah.
And they've just rented like an Airbus A380 to fly their people all over the world to go to these special meetings with, thousands and thousands of dollars for a ticket. And they think they're so high and mighty and special. It's actually just funny. If it wasn't sad, it would be funny.
I think too, for those of you that think that we're stuck on needing to know what you guys are doing all the time, because that seems to be the word in there that, we're sitting here marking your every move. We're not. We do this to be able to expose what we need to expose. So it's not that we want to sit here and watch every move you guys are doing because we think that you're worth it. No, that's not the case. The case is that we do this to expose what we need to expose in order to be able to free our families.
Absolutely. And most of the information like that lands in our laps anyways, doesn't it,
Yeah,
Cheryl?
exactly. Yeah.
Without asking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. I see Richard had to leave. So thank you so much, Guy, for joining us. And we'll definitely have you back on again. And thank you, Andrea, for joining us as well. But yeah.
All right. Well, it's been a bit of fun.
Please, everybody, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe and help get our views up and reach more people.
Let's end this podcast with Guy reading us a poem that was written after Aberdeen and going through some of the pictures that he sent us.
Until next time, everyone, we're sending much love to everybody. Hang in there. Bye-bye.
This is a poem that was written after the Aberdeen episode in July 1970 with Madeleine Kerr and Mr. James Taylor Jr. The author is unknown. The title is Our Pure Pool, namely James Taylor Jr. There are 8 verses. Jim Taylor was boss of exclusive PBs. He served long and hard for immoderate fees. O'er all the wide world none disputed his way, as he kept himself fit for a bottle a day. Draw the cork, for it is only 6 hours from Harrow to New York. Verse 2. His edicts poured forth like a river in spate. Beards, buns, bonnets and budges all met the same fate. But although it was sinful to wear a wristwatch, you could drown all your sorrows in lashings of scotch. For 11 long years we were sickened at heart by a ban on vacations and the 6 o'clock start, and we learned there was only one hope of survival: to stop being religious, vindictive and rival. But then came the day when the fair Madeleine set his heart all on fire with a longing to sin. It was love at first sight. There's no more to be said. They just flung off their clothes and hopped into bed. They were caught in the act by James, Alec and Stan. They said, "You're a corrupt and immoral old man." Jim sat up in bed and said, "Not on your life was I ever in bed with another man's wife." He said she was there just for washing his feet. He said a lot more that we couldn't repeat. But it was all to no purpose as he pleaded his case. They packed him off home to New York in disgrace. Jim Taylor's still boss of what's left of his band. They're waiting to follow him into the land. But when he has led them to Sinai's top, at last they will realize the whole thing is a flop. And now that we're free, we can celebrate, because we know we've been saved from a terrible fate. The tyrant o'erthrown and the victory won. We have liberty now, boys, and we shall have fun. Draw the cork, for it is only 6 hours from Harrow to New York.
How can you support Get a Life podcast? You can donate internationally via PayPal at www.paypal.me/getalifepodcast. PayPal also has a QR code that can be scanned. Or donate to our Get a Life podcast GoFundMe. If you're in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Check out www.get-a-life.net for Get a Life merchandise, books, and ways to support or get support. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.